On this episode of My First Quilt, we're going to be working with little tiny pieces to create a beautiful Civil War inspired quilt. Hi, I'm Sara and you're watching My First Quilt. And in today's episode, we are working on a beautiful Civil War inspired quilt. Now, I'm not much of a Civil War quilter, but I really love how this quilt turned out, and I loved some of the skills that I got to utilize working on it. You're working with small patches and points, so precise seams are important. And the entire quilt goes together with blocks set on point, which is also fun to play with. Now, with this particular quilt, you're making lots and lots of a smaller sized block. And you can work with a variety of different fabrics. You can kind of make it a little scrappy because we've got different fabrics in the centers of our stars, on our points, and in the squares that are offsetting all of those stars. But there are a couple of things about this quilt that kind of make it cohesive because we have frames around each of our blocks, and all of those frames are out of just two fabrics. And then there's one background fabric behind all of the stars, and one fabric in each of the setting triangles. So while this is a more scrappy project, you get to utilize a lot of different fabrics, there are some things about it that give it a nice consistent feel, so it doesn't look quite so scrappy on the eyes. I'm going to clear the quilts out of the way and bring up my pressing mat and all the pieces that we need to create this quilt. So here I've got all the pieces to create the blocks, and it all starts with squares and rectangles. You're going to have a lot of squares and rectangles, and again, you're going to vary the fabrics that you cut all these little squares out of, but your background fabric stays consistent. The first thing that we need to do is start by creating little mini flying geese. So we've done a lot of flying geese on the show before, but these are little bitty ones. So I've got my square, I'm putting it right into the corner. We're not doing the no waste style flying geese, you're actually making a flying geese unit. And what we want to do is to stitch from corner to corner to give yourself a visual line to follow as you stitch. I'm just going to kind of eyeball it. We'll take it to the machine here. And I'm all set up with a straight stitch, a center needle straight stitch, just to stitch across my little geese unit. And I did these kind of production line style. I did a whole bunch of them all at once. Once you have stitched across, now you need to cut off the excess. So you end up with all these little bitty leftover triangles. Give yourself about 1/4 inch seam allowance. And then it's really important to make sure that you press that contrast color piece out. You don't want to just finger press because when we stitch the second square onto our rectangle here, we want to make sure that we get a nice crisp point. So sometimes we try to cheat a little bit, you know, and just finger press it and stitch it. But with this particular method, it's really important to make sure that you actually press it. So I've got two ready to go here. I'm going to place another one on. And as I stitch this, I think it's easiest if I start in the outside corner and then stitch to where my first contrast flying geese point ended up, because then it kind of, as the machine moves, the presser foot sort of naturally presses that little flying geese out. So we'll stitch again with that center needle straight stitch. There we go. Perfect. And then once again, we're going to trim off that excess fabric. There you go, and give it a press. And you need, for each and every one of your blocks, 4 of these flying geese units. And you're going to make sure that all of your points are the same fabric so you don't have scrappy stars. Next, it's time to start creating the rows that will become the block. So once you've got all 4, and I've kind of switched to different fabric here, I like to lay everything out on a flat surface just to visualize what it's going to look like and the order that I need to stitch. First, I need to add one of my flying geese units to each side of my center square. And you want to make sure that your star fabric is touching your square fabric. So you're going to just lay your flying geese right on top here. And when you're stitching, what's really important to make sure that you've got nice triangle points is to make sure that your 1/4 inch seam comes right to the intersection of your flying geese unit right here. That's what's going to give you those perfect points on your stars. So when I'm stitching these, I like to make sure that I'm working with the flying geese unit facing up instead of down, because that way I can see exactly where that intersection is as I stitch to make sure that I'm not going to cut off the tips of the points on my triangles. We'll stitch along. I'm going to switch to a 1/4 inch seam real quick here. We were using a center needle stitch. Okay, so now we're ready to press. And if we look at this, you can see that I have just gone right over my intersection. And again, that's what's going to ensure that I've got a nice crisp point on my triangle. Now when we press this, I like to press toward the less bulky seam. So I've got two choices here, right? I could press it this way, in which case I'm turning all of those seam allowances over each other, or we can press toward that background square. That's going to minimize the bulk in our seams, and it's also going to help us to nest our seams together in the next step. So I'm just going to give them a nice little press, and then I'll open it back up again and press those seams. That's 1 and 2. So now I have the center portion of the block complete. I'll lay it back out here. And again, I've got nice points on my triangles. And then it's time to create the top and bottom of these rows. So we'll stitch those smaller background squares to 2 of our flying geese units. Now this is where you need to pay attention. I've got the wrong one in here. I would have different points on my star, so we'll take that guy out. And this is just a simple 1/4 inch seam on each side. And when you stitch those, I'll show you on this one, we're going to turn our seam allowances toward the background squares. So again, we're avoiding all of those bulky seams, and we're also giving ourselves the ability to nest. So now when I stitch this, I'm just going to nest those seams right together and take it to the machine and stitch with that same 1/4 inch seam. There we go. Now, of course, you can use pins to hold those nested seams in place. I just kind of guide it with my fingers as I go. And then when you open that out, you have 3 of the sides of your star, and then you're just going to add 1 more piece to the bottom. And here I've got one that's totally complete. We'll move some of this stuff out of the way. And we're almost done with our first block. So here's what it looks like once it's complete. Now it's time to add the borders. You're going to place your border strips, top and bottom, stitch with your 1/4 inch seam, and then your side borders that are a little longer go on next. Now they don't look like they fit yet because I haven't stitched it. You always have that 1/4 inch seam allowance, so once these are stitched, they're going to come in a little bit. Now once again, as you're stitching on your borders, let me show you, if I flip this around, I like to make sure that I sew from the back side so that I can watch where those points are going to land. It's this seam right here. I want to make sure that my stitching runs right along the intersection of my seams so that once again, when I pull this open, I have points to my stars. If you come inside of those seam allowances, you cut the tips off of the points. So you're going to create 48 of your star blocks, and then it's time to lay them out in the quilt. I'm going to clear all of this off so that I can show you exactly what this looks like and how we also add our setting triangles. Now this is where it might be helpful to have a design wall or somewhere that you can kind of lay out your blocks just to audition the positioning of everything. When you put this together, you're working in diagonal rows, so you're sewing in this sort of direction. And I just kind of laid it out to make sure that I had the same frames going down one way, and you'll see that in the quilt pattern, and then that none of my setting squares here were the same fabric touching. I tried to keep that a little bit consistent. I also tried to kind of make sure that the reds and the blues, because I've got red and blue stars, were kind of interspersed throughout the quilt so that nothing was kind of too matchy-matchy or all the blue in one area and all the red in another. So I just spent a little bit of time laying it out while I decided which direction I wanted to sew it all. Then it's time to add the setting triangles. Now you've got 2 different sizes of setting triangles, and that's because one is going to go in the corners, and the other gets set in between each of the blocks. So I like to just make sure that I lay it out on a flat surface. I would position my setting triangle over my block, put a pin so I know which seam to stitch it, and then add the next one on. And that way you don't end up accidentally sewing your triangle in the wrong direction. I did a couple like that. I sewed it in the wrong direction, flipped it out and said, that doesn't look right. Then I had to take it off and re-sew my triangle. So spending a little bit of time just kind of plotting out your rows as you stitch definitely saves time in the long run. And then once you've got all of those rows complete, you're going to sew row to row to row until you've created the entire quilt. So it's all set on point, which means that all of your squares are points facing up and down, but it still creates a square quilt. I hope that you've enjoyed learning about the scrappy stars and this cute little Civil War inspired quilt. Come and see me again on my first quilt show. My First Quilt is brought to you by Baby Lock, Free Spirit Fabrics, Madeira, and Hobbs Batting.